But I think Sal's got a great presentation, and if everybody could give a round of applause for Ms. Sal.
Good afternoon. Is it working right?
Yep.
I'm happy and I'm honored to be able to add my story of coming to America to this Deutsches Haus series. Thanks to Ana Guevara, my compatriot, for being the catalyst, and thanks to Wayne for all his dedication and hard work, and my friend Barry North for his help videotaping. Today I'm sharing with you the story of my family's plight as refugees fleeing Cuba in the 1960s and coming to New Orleans. It's the same or very similar to the stories of thousands of others who have come here, Cuban, Vietnamese, Central South American, and others. Basically, it's a story of hope and determination. Our stories have been woven into this great city's history, joining the tales of those who came before us. The Cubans and each other group became essential ingredients in that unique mixture of peoples and cultures that makes New Orleans so special. This is our beleaguered but loved flag. It's a backdrop to my story. I was born right in the middle of the Cuban Communist Revolution, and Fidel Castro declared victory just 4 months after my birth. Things got intolerable and desperate very fast under Fidel's communist regime, and that caused my family to leave our home and leave everything behind. But before I recount my personal journey, I wanted to start with some background information about the historical connections between Cuba and New Orleans. That history puts my journey here in context and shows how New Orleans was almost a natural to be a place of refuge for my family and our eventual home. As an example of that historical connection that has always existed between Cuba and New Orleans, the Cuban flag was sewn and first flown and displayed here in New Orleans, even before it was flown over Cuban soil. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. New Orleans was no stranger to Cuban affairs. Both places were heavily influenced by the laws, the culture, and the architecture of Spain. New Orleans was formally founded in 1718 by the French, but Spain ruled Louisiana from 1763 to 1803, and it governed this territory from Cuba. Louisiana became a Spanish colony and a province of the Captaincy General of Cuba, which had Havana as its capital. Moreover, after fires in the 1790s burned almost all the wooden structures built by the French, the Spanish rebuilt the city of New Orleans and modeled it after Havana. The famous streets of the Old Quarter still bear their Spanish names on the tiles that you can see on every corner. The first governor of Spanish Louisiana, Antonio de Ulloa, arrived in New Orleans in 1766 with just a few dozen soldiers. After a popular uprising against him, many more troops were sent to the city, and they came from Cuba. The second governor, Alejandro O'Reilly, traveled from Havana to New Orleans in 1769, and with him came 2,600 soldiers, basically doubling the population of the city. The fourth Spanish governor, after Governor Carondelet, was Don Bernardo de Galvez, who lived on Charter Street. He was instrumental in the city's development. New Orleans grew substantially both in population and commerce under Spanish rule. Many Cuban settlers immigrated to Louisiana between 1778 and 1802, so it's a migration that was happening since the 1700s. During that period, there was also immigration from Spain itself and other colonies of Spain, like the Canary Islands and things like that. Most of the ecclesiastical administration of colonial Catholic New Orleans was done through the Archdiocese of Havana. The connections are really unbelievable. In 1793, the Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas was created by Pope Pius VI. The first bishop of that new diocese, stationed in New Orleans, was Luis Ignacio Cárdenas, Cuba, who had presided previously over the Diocese of San Cristobal de La Habana, which had included Louisiana. By employing effective administrators who were culturally sensitive to the colony's French-speaking Creole population, the Spanish accomplished what the French had never done. They transformed Louisiana into a stable, growing outpost. I feel that the importance of the Cuba-Spain influence on this city and many milestones related to that history and relationship have been generally overlooked or forgotten. For example, such as the vibrancy and importance of that Spanish-speaking population in New Orleans, the first newspaper in Spanish printed in the United States was printed right here in New Orleans. And it was called El Mississippi, which I find the spelling of it kind of funny, but, you know, we just spelled it phonetically. But that was the first newspaper published in Spanish in the United States, and it was published right here in New Orleans. It included in pages historically significant publications like José Martí's Patria, which advocated for the independence of Cuba from Spain. It's all part of what I consider that secret that is the Spanish roots of New Orleans. And I have to mention, by the way, we're fortunate to have the Honorary Consul of Spain here today, Maria Isabel Page, and thank you for coming. In the Cuban War for Independence, in the Cuban War of Independence from Spain, New Orleans played an important role after the U.S. intervened in the ongoing battles on the side of the Cubans after the bombing of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The local newspaper in New Orleans kept the populace informed, and there was an unusual and a very high level of interest among New Orleanians supporting the Cuban people for their independence. In 1850, General Narciso Lopez, a native of Venezuela, started a campaign to aid in the overthrow of Spanish rule in Cuba. He relocated to New Orleans and raised the funds needed for the first expeditions from New Orleans to attempt to liberate Cuba from Spain. He had failed to raise the money or the people in other cities, but in New Orleans he recruited 750 men and all the funds necessary to go liberate Cuba. They failed, but returned safely. However, in 1851 he organized a second expedition that left from New Orleans. The Spanish executed 51 of those in that second expedition, including Lopez. The news broke here in New Orleans, which caused the citizens to riot and retaliate by attacking the Spanish consulate and other Spanish-owned properties in New Orleans. It's said that the protesters marched through the streets of the city with Cuban flags to the beat of Yankee Doodle until they reached the Spanish consulate. Staying on the topic of Cuban independence and the heroes in the forefront of that battle, of that struggle, we know Jose Marti, our national hero, was exiled in New York and Tampa. But very few people know that the Cuban revolutionary hero and the Dominican-born general Maximo Gomez was exiled right here in New Orleans in 1884. And another Cuban revolutionary hero, Antonio Maceo, joined him and was also exiled here in New Orleans. So, our connections to New Orleans really are historic. The Spanish were finally defeated by Cuban and U.S. forces in 1898. However, U.S. forces remained in Cuba, including the 2nd Regiment from Louisiana, until 1903. As I stated earlier, the connections are that our Cuban flag was flown here in New Orleans before it was displayed on Cuban soil 52 years before Cuba became an independent republic. Today on the 500 block of Poitras, downtown, there's a monument in front of the federal courthouse that is a tribute to General Narciso Lopez and those expeditions that left New Orleans for Cuba. It also honors the flag sewn and flown here. A local newspaper, the New Orleans Delta, printed a drawing of the Cuban flag on May 26, 1850, in honor of that display. As concerns economic activity, trade between New Orleans and Cuba was booming while under Spanish rule. In 1798, 102 vessels left the port of New Orleans, and 63 of those were bound for Havana. By 1840, New Orleans was the 4th largest port in the world, and steamship travel was incredible between New Orleans and Havana. In 1851, as seen in this slide, the newspaper El Pelayo, another Spanish daily that was printed in New Orleans, would list every day on page 1 the ships going between Havana and New Orleans. That connection continued through the years. By 1949, commercial ties were such that the Cuban government leased space in the old International Trade Mart, which is where the Four Seasons is now, and that they used that leased space to advertise Cuban goods and promote tourism. Of course, back then, New Orleans was known as the gateway to the Americas, a title that we held for a long time and somehow it slipped away from us. But we were the connection to Latin America. People from Latin America came to New Orleans for medical care. People, if you had to go to Latin America, you had to come to New Orleans. And it was something that created and fostered the growth of a very energetic Latino community in the city. State and city office holders and politicians traveled to Cuba often, and they received Cuban delegations here. In this next slide, you see then Mayor Vic Skiro, who was fluent in Spanish, I may add, receiving a Cuban delegation at City Hall in 1956. The slide also shows an ad for a Cuban panorama, an exhibit of Cuban art and culture that was presented to the city by Cuba and was installed at the International Trade Mart and stayed there for many, many years. By 1958, 1/3 of all goods passing through the port of New Orleans were destined for Cuba. So before the U.S. embargo, the largest foreign trading partner that with Louisiana was Cuba. So Cubans didn't come to America for quite some time. As I stated earlier, in the 1700s, since the 1700s. By 1850, the U.S. Census showed that of those born in Cuba, a third of the total resided in Louisiana. It wasn't Miami or South Florida, it was New Orleans and New York. By 1870, it was estimated there were around 12,000 Cuban-born immigrants in the U.S. That's 1870. 4,500 lived in New York, 3,000 were residents in New Orleans. So before the 20th century, New York City and New Orleans were the cities where Cubans predominantly lived. After the War of Independence, between 1899 and 1910, over 44,000 immigrants came to the U.S. from Cuba. That was the first large wave. It was now the early 20th century, and the focus really had switched, the final destination switched from New Orleans and New York to Florida. The next big wave of Cubans came to the U.S. in New Orleans around 50 years later after the Communist Revolution in the 1960s when my family came. And then after that, there was another big wave in the early 80s when 125,000 Cubans came in what was called the Maria boat lift. And they've continued coming and actually have surged in recent years. And just before we get to my personal journey and the stuff, I just thought two little slides on the migration issue were interesting because it shows that although relatively constant for over 300 years, a real boom in migration occurred when Castro came to power in 1959 and has continued since then. In 2022, the estimates were that there were 2.5 million Cubans or Cuban Americans in the United States, 15,000 in Louisiana. And in terms of the states, Florida, of course, is alone at number one. The second tier includes California, Texas, New Jersey, and New York. And Louisiana is in the third tier of states in terms of the Cuban population. The presence of the Cuban community here is forever memorialized in the statue of Jose Marti, Cuban poet, philosopher, and national hero, which we erected in Mid-City on Norman Francis and Banks. And it's also obviously in many shops, businesses, and restaurants and other things that we've built in this community since we've been here. So given that history and those connections, I think my family's arrival here as part of that wave of Cuban refugees that came in the 60s was really just a more recent chapter in a migration that has existed for hundreds of years. Switching the focus to Cuba, it had weathered a sometimes turbulent but comparatively fruitful 20th century after gaining its independence from Spain. The Cuban Republic had advanced and progressed so much so that by 1958, the year before Castro rode into Havana, it was considered one of the most cultured and stable nations in the Western Hemisphere. It was at the top of almost every index of economics, education, literacy, and development. The next three slides I'll show you will be glimpses of the Cuba that I was born into. That's not New York, that's not downtown New Orleans, that was downtown Havana. That's what the streets of Havana looked like, before Castro. Like the streets of any other bustling metropolis. Before Castro came to power, like I said, Cuba had a very high standard of living. It had a large middle class, 80% of the population was literate. It had the second lowest infant mortality rate in the hemisphere. And in 1957, it was a country with the greatest number of doctors per capita and the greatest number of houses with electricity in all Latin America. It's just another street scene. In 1958, despite its size of 6.5 million people, Cuba was number 29 among major world economies. This would seem a very unlikely place for a communist revolution of the proletariat, but unfortunately, Cuba was also plagued with corrupt and ruthless dictator, and really too much administrative corruption. Like many other countries in Latin America, there was unjust enrichment amongst the population, and there was popular discontent. Nonetheless, the stark unbelievable the decay and the deterioration of everything on the island in the last 60 years can't be denied. This is a scene of a street in Havana, the same street. Top picture, obviously, 1950, bottom picture, 2022. Same thing. Before the revolution and after the revolution. And it's something you really can't escape that reality of the physical. Obviously, the freedoms and the repression is the most important part of it. But just the physical decay and the visual, it's just something you can't, as a a Cuban, you can't get beyond it. But that's what Cuba looks like, today. That's Havana. Now, surely if you go there as a tourist, you'll see a real pretty little section to bring you to, but that's the reality of Cuba today. So this is a map of Cuba, 90 miles off the coast, right? I was born and lived in Bayamo, which is in Oriente province, now called Granma province. It's on the eastern side of the island where the star is. It's near the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Bayamo is one of the oldest and probably the most historic of all Cuban towns and cities. I'm sure people from other towns will argue that, but that's Bayamo. Long before the Spanish colonizers arrived in the 1490s, there already existed an indigenous Taino village at that location. The village was officially founded in 1513 by Diego Velázquez. That's the second town on the island founded by the Spanish for the crown. My hometown of Bayamo became even more famous as Cubans fought for independence. During one epic battle on January 9, 1869, as the Spanish troops moved toward the town to quash an uprising and take the city, the citizens of Bayamo were forewarned. They burned the entire town to the ground, rather than let the Spanish seize it. That's the remnants of the burning. That's what the Spanish saw when they got there. It is the only town or city, I have to be proud of my hometown, it's the only town or city mentioned in our national anthem, and then in the opening line. And the entire city was designated a national monument. After the Spanish colonial boom, Bayamo became an independent cultural and economic town. In terms of my family, my genealogy, my parents, like me, were born in the same town of Bayamo, and my roots are predominantly in Spain, and really until recently I thought completely in Spain, but I'll tell you all about that in a minute. On my father's side, we came from Spain, both Asturias in the north and the Canary Islands way farther south. My grandmother was born in Lanzarote in the Canary Islands. My mom's family was more Cuban, with one great-grandfather from Sitges in Catalonia in Spain. And these next two slides are just, this is from my grandparents and some of my ancestors. And then these two slides are just, that's the town in Asturias where Longoria come from. That's where my grandmother was born. Just the town where we come from. That's Sitges. And then there's Bonn, Germany, which is something interesting because I would never have expected this slide to have a picture of Bonn, Germany, but the great coincidence as we sit here in Deutsches Haus, I told Wayne about this, was that all my life I was told that my great-great-grandmother, who was a New Orleanian, Josephine Unruh, was a New Orleanian, and nothing else. The story was that she had fallen in love with my great-great-grandfather, who was in the consular corps of Cuba. He had traveled here, they had met, and they fell in love. She went back to Cuba, and thus came my mother with green eyes, my grandmother was a blonde, and the German part of the family. But I just found out that a couple of years ago that her father, Henry, was born in Bonn, North Westphalia, Germany, and her mother was Swiss. So I actually have German and Swiss blood. So I guess my being here at Deutsches Haus was for a reason. And they at least spurred some genealogical research which confirmed something that my family didn't know, or at least I didn't know. But my personal life journey as well as my family's immigrant journey leaving Cuba and ending up here begins where I was born, in Bayamo, in the shadow of the Sierra Maestra mountain range. That's important because the Sierra Maestra mountain range is where the revolution started. It's the part of the island where the Castro rebellions had begun. The fighting between dictator Fulgencio Batista's army and Fidel Castro's rebels was intense. It was basically paralyzing my hometown. It was not uncommon to have one side shooting from the front of the property towards the back and the other side shooting in the opposite direction. When I was born, the most severe battles of the revolution were occurring, and they were happening right outside our front door in my hometown. It was August of 1958, in the middle of the night, and my family was jolted from sleep by gunfire, which had erupted again overhead. It was really, it must have been a horrible time to live, especially in that town, because again, the revolution was literally happening outside of my house. Amidst the fear and the horror of being in the crosshairs of that battle, my pregnant mother went into labor. Her contractions started and she endured waves of pain that entire night into the early hours of the next morning. And they weren't sure if they could even reach a clinic or a hospital because if anybody wandered outside, they'd be a target. My family became very anxious, and after a few hours, the anxiety grew into hysterics. Seeing no other option, my father ran out through the front door in his undershirt, jumped the fence, and was able to get in his car. Moving with stealth and no lights, he parked the car as close as possible to the front door, flew back inside the house. My mother had already grabbed some essentials and was standing near the door, grimacing in pain, standing in a puddle of water. The water had broken. Time was of the essence. It was decided that my sisters, the girls, along with my maternal grandmother, would stay at home in a closet for safety. Staying low to the ground to avoid stray bullets, my parents and my grandfather crawled on all fours to the car and drove to a friend's house, almost blind because a visible head would have been target. And my mom was crouched in the wall of the back seat. My father drove to the friend's house that was a doctor. And that's how, in the middle of a full-blown gun battle and dodging gunfire, and amidst unreal histrionics and pain, I was born. The applause from my mom. No doubt that was a harbinger of things to come. Fulgencio Batista, that was the dictator before dictator Castro. Unfortunately, Cubans, I guess, like dictators. I was born when things were reaching a real boiling point for Mr. Batista. He had been initially elected president in 1940, but then seized the presidency for a second time with a coup and the use of military support as opposed to an electoral victory. That culminated in him forming a right-wing dictatorship, and he ruled with a cruel, heavy hand until 1959. In the late 50s, Cuba was dealing with a lot of corruption, as I said, under Batista. Cuba had really turned into a playground for rich Americans and Europeans, and everything ran on bribes and kickbacks. The main casinos were operated by Meyer Lansky, the gangster, who it's reported paid Batista over $1 million a month for his license. Those things made Batista even more hated, and it really set the stage for January 1st, 1959, when that happened. It became quite obvious after Fidel won and entered Havana on his tank that a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship was being created. Just 2 days after he rode triumphantly into Havana on the tank, the firing squad started all over the island. So for many people, the honeymoon was over very fast. In fact, many who had supported Castro and yearned to depose Batista and end the corruption changed course rapidly and became opposition dissenters and leaders of the opposition as soon as they realized what was going on with the repression in the communist regime. And that was the case even for some members of my extended family. The result was just increased tension and division down to the level of the nuclear family. Castro set about turning Cuba into a giant communist prison camp. Like all dictators, he needed an enemy, and he selected the U.S. He seized property that belonged to Americans worth over $1 billion in 1959 currency. Within months, he had signed agreements with the Soviet Union by which Cuba became its satellite in exchange for weapons, advisors, and KGB agents to train Cuba's secret police. He murdered the top military man in the country, the top judge, and anybody who voiced opposition was put in prison for up to 30 years. As many as 100,000 political prisoners were soon behind bars without trials. Torture became routine, and prisoners who had broken no laws were summarily executed for daring to criticize Fidel. The revolution was created and managed by the only political party, the Cuban Communist Party. In 1961, Castro announced there would be no elections, and there really had not been any free and fair elections since, in 60 years, over. These particular developments stunned my family, obviously. Both my mother and father's families had been involved in Cuban politics. My grandfather on my mom's side was actually a representative in the legislature in Havana, and two of my town's mayors had been related to me. My parents were very worried and really horrified when they saw Castro began nationalizing industries, changing the currency, even changing the provincial names and the boundaries. He basically just turned Cuba upside down. Threats to the press commenced, and slowly but surely, every single newspaper, magazine, radio, everything was seized and closed down. The oppression started and grew, and soon the jails were full. By 1964, estimates put the number of executions that had occurred at around 10,000. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned for opposing the revolution. The regime then resorted to labor and indoctrination detention camps, which were open to hold all of the non-conformists. As seen in the slide, thousands of Cubans were sent to labor and prison work camps known as military units to aid production, or Cubans called them UMAP, Not only were dissidents and those opposed to the Castro regime sent there and imprisoned or involuntarily shipped to those camps, but they were also used to detain gay people, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and other people that the regime considered undesirable. Around 300,000 Cubans had already gone into exile, 4,000 had claimed asylum in embassies, and around 3,000 had left by boat. So as I'm growing out of infancy and really taking my first steps and speaking my first words, the world around me was collapsing. My family was filled with terror. No one could be trusted. Everything had to be whispered. Defiance was met with swift punishment. This is a slide of El Paredón, which my aunt confirmed we had one like 3 blocks from my house. And that's definite swift punishment. El Paredón which in Spanish means the big wall, was a place of retribution and a never-present threat to those who dared dissent. They would be rounded up, taken by force from their homes or from work, and placed in a row in front of a wall and executed. And as I said, one of them was really close to my house. You could hear the shots day and night. The new regime modified the Constitution, now allowing for the confiscation of assets without any judicial intervention. Of course, the death penalty was expanded, and the regime created 100,000 what they called Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, or CDRs, which were basically just snitches at the block level of every city and town, so they could turn in dissenters or people opposed to Castro into the authorities. The dictatorship started obligatory military service for anyone over 16. Foreign travel was restricted and then prohibited for Cubans. The government's seizures of lands and buildings began with properties that belonged to foreign nationals and conglomerates. At first it was just large businesses and things like that, but then they started seizing hotels, refineries, small businesses, banks. Things progressed, and then the regime was seizing the properties, homes, and businesses of Cubans as well. My family had our home, our farm, our business, everything seized. Everything was confiscated. The Catholic Church was accused of being counter-revolutionary, but attacks were also leveled at Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and other religious groups. Most religious events and services were prohibited. This slide will nuns were expelled en masse in large numbers, and priests were either detained or expelled as well. The historic Iglesia de San Salvador, the Catholic Church in Bayamo, in the Central Park and Central Plaza, was going to be closing. The Catholic schools had all closed, and the real fervent parishioners like my parents were devastated. After the closing of the Catholic schools and the church and the expulsion of the nuns and priests was one of those things that was really, really detrimental to my family and to my parents because they were very, very Catholic. They were in a group that then organized a mass sacramental ceremony in my hometown in the cathedral, where mostly all the children and some older folks received as many sacraments as we could at one fell swoop before the last priest left. And as a matter of fact, that's where I was confirmed and got my first Holy Communion at the age of 3, along with a whole bunch of other kids that just got as many sacraments as they could. Soon, most churches, synagogues, and religious institutions had been shuttered. And many, if not most, clergy and other religious had been forced into exile. The revolutionary government seized all the Catholic schools and fired all the teachers. All the schools obviously had to now teach the same curriculum, which was the state curriculum, which was heavy on indoctrination and slogans. All the textbooks were really just propaganda. And the kids were even sent to overnight camps or boarding schools for proper training. That's what education was becoming in Cuba. It was those repressive measures that were taken against the Catholic Church, schools, and clergy, along with the indoctrination of the kids, that finally convinced my parents to leave Cuba. And much of the urgency related on the fact that I was the youngest and I had 2 older sisters, and my oldest sister was already in elementary school, so she was already being subjected to the slogans and the indoctrination, and you know, when she came home from school, my parents were just appalled. At about this time, countries across the world started breaking relations with Cuba. The economy tanked because it had a bad sugar harvest, and since then, in the early 60s, to today, the famous libreta, or ration book, has existed in Cuba. Medicine and food started to be rationed, and it still is rationed if you can find it. Each household would get a ration book, or la libreta, that details how much food each family or person was entitled to acquire. I brought this back from a trip to Cuba myself. This is, one of my cousins, Libreta. As well, at that time in Cuba, you saw the story, the pictures earlier of Havana downtown looked just like, that's how you see, that's what the stores look like since the city, and they still look that way. The stores that the Cubans have to go to and buy with Cuban currency. There are stores that you can buy products with using US dollars, which cater to tourists or to people who live in Cuba who have family here who send them dollars. And those stores are pretty well stocked, actually. And they talk about an embargo. You can find any U.S. product there that you want at the stores in dollars. They just don't come from Miami. They come from Jamaica or from Central America, but they get there. But it's just the stark reality for Cubans are just empty store shelves everywhere you go. Academic degrees were suspended. The university began to expel all students labeled as anti-revolutionary. That was pretty vague. Soviet arms flooded Cuba. Attempts at overthrowing Castro like the Day of Dates failed. The embassy filled with more asylum seekers. More exiles poured out of Cuba. The situation grew scarier and more threatening every day. My sister had walked into the house one afternoon, she's here today. As she strolled down the hallway, she overheard my parents talking in the bedroom, and it was time, they agreed. Time for us to leave Cuba. She was frightened and she ran away when she heard the news. Although my family's preparation and our plans to leave were intentionally kept a secret, somehow someone snitched. The block committee found out, and the regime went into action. That happened often because snitches were rewarded for their snitching, for their information. They would gain power within the Communist Party, and they would be given material goods, in some cases houses, all of which had been stolen and seized from people that were leaving. We were just a second family unit and my extended family to leave. In our case, since the government heard that my family wanted to leave and come to the United States, they came and did an inventory of our house and of my father's veterinary business. Every single object, book, piece of silverware, furniture, jewelry, anything was cataloged and inventoried. The purpose was to prohibit us from taking it with us, obviously, and to even deny us the right to give it to someone else, because that was now the property of the state. Everything belonged to the state. We were now fingered as being anti-revolutionaries. We were marked as enemies of the state. We were gusanos, or worms. That's what the communists like to call us back then. And the revolution owned everything that we had possessed before that. At least my family was spared with these slides show actos de repudio. They were inflicted on many others. These were public displays of violence and humiliation that are still being done today, that would be carried out by the local Communist Party against those opposed to the regime. It would usually take place in front of your home, where a group of party faithful would come together and throw things at your house, hurl insults, chant, beat people, and do property damage, just to show how much of a gusano you really were. We later found out that a few days after we had left Cuba, a miliciano, or a soldier of the Revolutionary Army, was sent to my paternal grandfather's house. The claim they made was that some items or assets were missing that were in the inventory of my family's belongings. We were already here in the States. They held my grandfather with a gun pointing to his head and interrogated him for hours while they ransacked and destroyed his house. The militia members spent an entire day and night searching and ripping things apart at his house. The trauma was such that he was never the same. After that ordeal, everybody mentioned that. Several months later, my father received a telegram from Cuba, who were already here in New Orleans, informing him that his father had passed away. And a few months later, my grandmother died of a broken heart. My father obviously wasn't able to go to either one of their funerals. But that's kind of the story of everybody about Cuba at that time period, the division of the family. The day that we left Cuba, actually, the day that we flew from Havana to Miami, really, and people say, you were only 4 years old, how do you remember? Well, I don't know, I remember. It was one of those visceral things that even as a kid, you know that some heavy stuff is going on. We were leaving the house, and I would look from the back of the car towards the back, and you would see the crowds, the people walking behind the car as we pulled out to the airport. It was, seeing friends and relatives walking in the street. It was like a procession behind the car, people waving. In the wake of our departure, I was clutching travel papers that prominently featured my black and white passport picture. My maternal grandfather was with me when it was taken. I don't remember this, they told me that before I could smile for the picture, as any 4-year-old would, he looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't smile. This is a very sad occasion." So, that's the picture. The next and final memory of that fateful day was, and again, I think I remember this, maybe I just heard the story so many times, but it was at the actual airport leaving, where they had a section called La Pecera, which means the aquarium in Spanish. And that was where the glass walls divided the passenger zones, divided those that were leaving from the traders, from those that were staying. It was a place, as you can imagine, of tension and emotion. My sisters and I were separated from our parents while they were questioned and underwent body searches individually. Wedding bands, jewelry, anything of value was confiscated. Cubans leaving the U.S. were allowed to take only the clothes on their back and 2 other sets of clothing. No cash, no valuables. It was a policy that served to humiliate us and also to make our life outside of Cuba as difficult as possible, which is what they wanted. This is a legal document that my father had drafted in 1963, which, if you read it, it's astounding. The desperation of my parents to get their kids out of Cuba was such that my father had secured this document and executed this document for our departure. It's entitled Authorization and License. And in the first and second declaration of that document, which I've listed here in Spanish, the desperation just becomes so evident to get the kids out. My parents authorized each other to leave Cuba with the kids in case one of them wasn't allowed to leave. And even authorized the 3 minor children to be allowed to, quote, abandon the national territory and travel to any foreign country for whatever amount of time they find convenient, utilizing any available means of transportation. In other words, anyone in the world could go anywhere in the world by any took any of their kids out of Cuba, that's all they wanted. This permission was given so that the 3 minors could leave alone or with any other person whatsoever. We boarded a plane and flew to Miami on a flight filled with other exiles in what became known as the Freedom Flights in the 1960s. At least 2 and sometimes more flights would arrive in Miami every day, chock full of family. So I was barely 4 years old when this happened, and again, we had lost everything. Upon landing in Miami, coming at the heels of the mass hysteria, the McCarthy and the Red Scare in the United States, we were arriving from kindness country and all that, and people in the U.S. was happy, but they wanted to vet and check everyone extensively, because it was a kind of kindness country. So all of those who came with the illegal forged documents were asked to step forward on the tarmac in Miami. My father did so, because as it turns out, I was the only one that had all legitimate, valid documents. The rest of my family had forged passports and things like that to get out. So my father was detained and interrogated for several days. My mother recounts those days without my father when she recalled that we stayed, her memory was that we stayed at the Lincoln Hotel in a part of Miami called Opalaca. At least that's what she remembered about that nightmarish place that we found ourselves as we waited to hear news about my father. It was actually called the Hotel Leamington, a conclusion that I came to recently when I found this yellowed, tattered envelope in an old drawer. Scribbled on the face of the envelope is Salva, which is a misspelling of my lifelong nickname, Salva. And the envelope obviously is printed with the logo of the Hotel Leamington. Unfortunately, the misnaming of the hotel is really the only part of the story that's not painful and sad. While waiting at the hotel, we were lost. And since none of us spoke English, things were grim. My sisters and I were little kids, so we were basically always lost. My father was in charge of contacting relatives upon our arrival, and now he was detained. So he couldn't do a thing. My mother didn't have the information, so she felt lost and hopeless and helpless and basically cried all day. The man who managed the hotel felt pity for us. I guess somehow or another found out what was going on about our predicament. And so while we were at that hotel, he would buy a large, my mom said it was big, a big, large hamburger each day and give it to my mom. She would then cut it into 4, and that we would have our meals for the day. Fortunately, after a few days, my mom was able to locate a cousin that already arrived in Miami months earlier, and he took us in at his one-bedroom apartment. Days later, my father was released from interrogation and detention, and he joined us in those crammed emergency makeshift accommodations. Apart from the freedom flights, as more and more Cubans feared for their children to have them avoid the indoctrination camps, the scarcity of food, and the other repressive measures, the Peter Pan flights, or Operation Pedro Pan, started. Children were being separated from their families, and parents became more desperate. So in conjunction with the Catholic Church between 1960 and 1962, the Pedro Pan operation, airlifted more than 14,000 kids without their parents alone to the United States. And there's some Pedro Pan kids here in the audience today. And they went all over the States. And they went, and so, like I said, some of my cousins were in that group. Hundreds of thousands, if not thousands of Cubans were arriving in Miami monthly. As a result, the government and different charities, including the Catholic Church, mobilized to resettle Cubans in other parts of the United States. Offices and centers were opened as shown in this slide. In 1962, at the U.S. Catholic Conference in Miami, it was decided that a Catholic Cuban center would be opened here in New Orleans. The center was known to us, the Cubans, as El Refugio. Everybody just goes as Refugio, right? The Refugio had a contract with the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to provide health care and resettlement services. The Catholic churches in the city of New Orleans took up a special collection for the Cubans. But by 1971, the Catholic Cuban Center of New Orleans was handling several thousand cases per month, and it really was overwhelmed. This next slide shows a bulletin that was published by the Resettlement Center, and which we talk about other where Cubans would be resettled, and of course Louisiana was one of those places, but there were really resettling Cubans in almost every state in the Union. After the experiences of my father's detention and all else that had transpired after we arrived in Miami, a clean start somewhere else started to look real good. Though literally penniless, my parents and my uncles and aunts found hope and determination from somewhere and never gave up. As they surveyed and investigated the possibilities, New Orleans kept popping up. In part, it was due to those historical connections that I mentioned earlier that Cuba and New Orleans have always had. It was a city that was known to us, to them. The other Cubans had already arrived here in New Orleans. The existence of the sugar industry was also a connection. People that worked in the sugar industry, like in downtown in Cuba, could come here and work in the sugar industry here in Louisiana. At a personal level, my paternal grandfather had a cattle business in Cuba, and he had associates in Covington. My mother's uncle had also left Cuba before communism and had come to New Orleans. So we decided to take advantage of that, of the resettlement program, and we chose New Orleans as our new home. But I have to mention Josephine and Heinrich, or Henry Unruh. Heinrich was born in Bonn, Germany. Josephine is my great-great-grandmother, the daughter of Henry, and she was, I just found out today, was here in New Orleans, but the German roots were unknown to me 2 years ago. But of course, because of that, that was another pull, another New Orleans connection for us. So we flew from Miami to New Orleans, started a new life. This next picture is just funny. This is our first Christmas in the United States, but I like this picture because we were freezing. We thought we were in the Arctic. We thought we were in Antarctica, coming from Cuba. And so I don't know how he mustered a smile, because I remember that all we could talk about was how cold it was. And we put little glasses of water outside on the windowsill and it was freezing. We were like amazed. But that's our first New Orleans Christmas. Once we arrived in New Orleans, many of the Cubans were settling here, and many of us were housed temporarily in an apartment complex called Park Chester. That's my uncle, my cousin who's here, and me, and my cousin's sister. The Park Chester apartments were developed on a 48-acre tract, I don't know if people here remember them, on Paris Avenue in Gentilly. They had opened in 1849 and were demolished in 1974 because when they became blighted. There were 1- and 2-bedroom apartments. They were very humble, but it was a fortunate opportunity for the Cubans because it gave us a place to live where there were other Cubans, so we could speak to other people, fellowship, support, if somebody found out something, whatever. So it was a good way to start a new life in a new country for my family. But I just have to mention, everything wasn't rosy for the arriving Cubans at Parkchester. Some of the people who lived around Parkchester were up in an uproar over the arriving Cubans. My sister recalls that there were some kids that would attack us at the apartment complex. On one occasion, though, they had locked her out of the building where our apartment was located. She was determined to get in, and she punched the glass, broke it, and they ran off scared. We never had any more problems with them. We lived in Parkchester until my parents were able to rent another bigger apartment in that same genteel neighborhood where many other Cubans were settling, including many of my relatives. We moved to an apartment in a house divided into 4 apartments on St. Bernard Avenue, and all the other residents of apartments in the house were also Cuban refugees. As a group, we were welcomed by the Catholic Church, which is kind of like a line through our whole thing. And our families were assisted with tuition breaks to Catholic schools. Since the Catholic faith and the repression of the church really were one of the main reasons why my parents had fled Cuba, my family was very appreciative of the church's interactions with us. That's us at St. Leo the Great, and that's us, and that's me at Christ the King, which was the second school we went to, where Jay went. The house that we lived in on St. Bernard Avenue was literally next door to St. Leo the Great. And there was a fence dividing, and my house and then the nun's house and the church and all that was like next door to each other. And that's only important because I didn't enjoy a very seamless introduction to U.S. education. And I had language challenges and adjustment problems. It got bad enough that I would run away from school every day, all the way to the other side of the fence. But yeah, I wanted to run away, I wanted to go home. So I can imagine what the scene looked like because the nuns would go to my house to retrieve me. So, and 3 short, rosy-cheeked, stocky nuns with the traditional, all the way to the 4 habits would come to my house and grab me by my hands and feet and walk me down, carry me down St. Bernard Avenue back to the school. So that must have been a sight. While living on St. Bernard, this is a funny footnote, my sisters and I would wander a few blocks away, and since we had nothing, we would always go to where all the rich Americans lived. And we would be amazed at the treasures they were throwing away in garbage. And we would bring that to my mom, my poor mom. So my poor mom had to smile and receive the gifts that we brought her from the garbage cans. Around this time, I was also my grandfather's interpreter and right-hand man. So even though I was just 6 or 7, I would take him on buses and streetcars to rallies downtown and meetings and things like that, and I was his translator and his interpreter. And some of these meetings and rallies that we would go to in downtown New Orleans would be full of other Cuban exiles, mostly older men. This banner came from one of those meetings. I loved it. It's tattered now. I don't know how it became that tattered, but since we were called gusanos, worms, there was a little worm with a machine gun, and boarded that animals, we will return. Which was the sentiment back then. For a lot of Cuban refugees, this was temporary. There's the story of many Cubans that kept their bags packed, their suitcase packed to go back. This was just like a temporary bump in time that was no way communism was going to stay in Cuba. As the years passed, though, obviously more and more relatives kept coming, and these next slides show the group that was amassing. Those were all my relatives. That was at our house in Tarrytown, as was that. Cousins, uncles, and aunts, all relatives. So that was a blessing that most of my extended family did end up here. After 3 or 4 years living in the apartment on St. Bernard Avenue, my parents were able to buy a little modest home in Tarrytown, which was then brand new on the West Bank. My father had been able to recertify his veterinary credentials and got all his things lined up in the U.S. and was able to start practicing as a veterinarian. That had taken several years. In the interim, my mom had begun working for 2 doctors, very well-known doctors in the city, and she continued in that job until she retired in the late 50s. After passing certification exams, my father began work at LSU Medical School here in New Orleans, downtown. He worked in the animal care department, the department that handled all the research animals. And then he and my uncle opened up a private veterinary clinic called Delta Animal Clinic on the West Bank. As kids, we lived in Tarrytown now. We were transferred to the new Catholic school, Christ the King. I was now in the 3rd grade. My English was almost perfect by then. I learned pretty fast, and I was now a competitor in speech tournaments. Believe it or not, yeah. I mostly did in the original oratory category with speeches that I had written myself. The speech that won the most praise was called What America Means to Me, which was very much in keeping with the theme of today, of coming to America. Our move to Tarrytown and Christ the King school has been beneficial for my family, again, because most all of my other relatives moved to that same neighborhood with us. And even in my grade, in my fourth grade or third grade at the new school at Christ the King, there were 4 other Cuban kids in my class. So there really was a large bunch of Cuban families that moved to that neighborhood at the same time, which always made it easier for adjustment sake for my parents especially. Those early years required a lot of hard work, a lot of tenacity. It was a task to adjust to all the complexities of the new life, especially for my parents. However, again, being with relatives and Cuban friends made things easier and made us happy. Every day the kids went off to school, parents went off to work, and we adjusted to our new American schedule, our new American life. But every evening and every weekend, we would take that station wagon to Pontchartrain and the beach. And it was a chance to celebrate our Cuban culture and our identity and keep the traditions of our homeland alive in union with those relatives and friends. I went on to Shaw High School, stayed here at Loyola University, Loyola Law School. As a matter of fact, I'm an adjunct professor now at Loyola Law School, so I can't get away from Loyola. So for almost 20 years after Castro took the reins of power, there was simply no way for me or any of the other exiles to go back to Cuba in any way. We were barred. But then in the late 70s, early 80s, the exile community, who had been called traitors to the revolution and worse, were now allowed to travel back to visit family and bring our sacred U.S. dollars with us, of course. I yearned to go back so I was making my preparations to go back to Cuba. Before I could get on one of those flights, though, and return, in 1994, there was the Balsero, the rafter crisis, where thousands of Cubans just hit the ocean in makeshift boats and inner tubes, anything they could get off the island on. The U.S. government intercepted them and took them to Guantanamo Naval Base. I was now a practicing attorney here in New Orleans when a group of Cuban American lawyers formed in Miami to lend the refugees help and to advance their pleas for asylum and for safe passage. Obviously, that's me landing in Guantanamo, and that's me with the group of rafters that I was working with. So I was contacted to see if I was interested in going back, and obviously my answer was absolutely, I'm ready right now. So 2 weeks after that phone call, I landed on Cuban soil, but at the U.S. Naval Base. So legally, I was still in U.S. territory. But regardless, when I got off that plane and that picture was taken, it was like a lightning bolt that went through my body. In 1997, I returned to Cuba officially for the first time since leaving as a 4-year-old. I was 34. And that represented the first contact that my immediate family outside of the island had with my relatives who had stayed or couldn't get out. And I stayed with cousins in Havana. And the next trip back was on November 5th of 1999, when my mother, my eldest sister, and I departed New Orleans for Havana. And from there, we actually flew to Bayamo, my hometown. And again, going back to your ancestral land where it all started is something that's incredible, but being able to do it with my mother was a really unforgettable experience. So having been there and lived it, and going back there and reading and seeing it again, I got to tell you, the island's natural beauty is unmatched. It's a beautiful place. And I actually see a lot of similarities culturally between New Orleans and Cuba. And Cuba's got the rhythms of dance and music that are praised worldwide, and the people are pretty amazing, but the reality of daily life there is still pretty terrific. It's sad. Dissent is not an option. Freedom that we take for granted don't exist there, and repression is severe. Growing up here, my dream and my plan was seriously always to return to Bayamo one day. And my plan was to graduate from here, do whatever I did, and then go back and help with rebuilding and invest and do whatever I needed to do because I really felt that I was supposed to have lived there. And that dream obviously never materialized, so I had no choice but to accept that this incredible city was meant to be our home. So as an individual, a family, and a community, we hopefully have forged on. We're grateful to have come to America, and still with that hope and determination shown by my parents, aunts and uncles, and relatives and friends, that they really were our great generation. Coming to America gave us our only chance at freedom, and our only chance at happiness. So our individual and collective gratitude is boundless, and hopefully we've shown that. So I close with family pics. My family in Cuba, my family in New Orleans. Thanks for letting me share my coming to America story. Thank you very much.